You know, I love the Game Boy. But what if it just isn't super enough? Well, I present to you the Super Game Boy. Yeah, this came out in 1994, and... well, fuck it, let's go play it. It won't work! And that's because this uses the Super Nintendo for power and display. So instead of playing one of the best Mario games of all time, Super Mario World, you could play Super Mario Land. Asshole. Taking a look at the Game Boy games when you play it on the Super Game Boy, they actually look relatively good. And it was advertised on the box. It's in color. Well, not really. Color palettes, so you can kind of just change the color whatever you want, right? Except it's still only in 4 colors like the original Game Boy. Or the Game Boy Color. So it's not that big of a difference. It's just kind of like, woo. The cool thing is when you first load your Super Game Boy, you get the picture frame that looks like the Game Boy, which is kind of cool. And then you can pick from certain other ones. And you can pick from other frames, which is, kind of cool. Of course, you always got to keep it at the Game Boy, though. And certain games, like Pokemon Blue, for example, have a special frame around it. Which, that's kind of nice, because it doesn't make the game look too stretched out by not having that, you know what I mean? Like, if the game was just all the way to the screen, it would look a little stretched out. You can change the color of the color palette. So if you were dumb, you could change the entire thing to just one color. And then, yeah, you get graffiti, so you can draw wherever you want. Is it kind of cool? Yeah, it's kind of cool. Is it unnecessary? Yeah, it's really unnecessary, but it's cool. I mean, if you care that much. You can even doodle on the game if you want to play hard mode. Just, yeah, fuck you. You can't see this. The Super Game Boy is a really cool concept, but there is just so much unnecessary stuff that just... it's cool to have, but it really doesn't do anything. Also, because it's playing off the Super Nintendo sound chip instead of the Game Boy sound chip, the sound is a little bit high-pitched. And with the original Super Game Boy, the game plays just a little bit faster. So, why? I have no idea. It's probably something to do with the Super Nintendo. But the game does play a little bit faster. Also, it doesn't have any link cable support. So, you want to trade on Pokemon? Well, too fucking bad. You can't. So that kind of sucks. So while, yes, it will... you can put Game Boy cartridges in it. It will fit. It don't work. It's like putting a normal Game Boy Color game inside of a Game Boy. It don't work. Which is kind of disappointing, but it makes sense. Because this came out in 1994. The Game Boy Color came out in 1998, if I remember correctly. So, overall, it's a cool piece of technology. Is it necessary? It's up to you. Personally, I'd rather play Super Mario World over Super Mario Land. But it's a great way to play the Pokemon games. But other than that, there's just not really a use, in my opinion. It's cool. It is really cool. And it is a nice way to play the Game Boy games on the TV. Until you learn the Game Boy Player on the GameCube exists. Because guess what? That plays Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Making this obsolete. If you can afford it. Because the disc is like $150. But if you can afford that, this is completely obsolete. So... it's cool, and it was definitely a good idea at the time, but there's no reason. There's no reason to own it anymore. It's really cool. If you want to play just Game Boy games on the TV, go ahead, but just get a Game Boy Player. If you can afford it, a Game Boy Player is just better. But yeah. Do I recommend it? eh. If you just want to play, if there's just a specific 1 or 2 games you want to play on your TV, go ahead. But like I said, the Game Boy Player is more money, but you can play all of your Game Boy games on the TV. Every Game Boy game versus this is just normal Game Boy.